the pressure needs to be put on those in power. And I'm not just talking political power, we're talking about corporate power as well. Just having the news attention on it is not the same as having like the audience are basically reading it.
Yeah.
Then it's not the same thing as the audience understanding it.
Yeah.
Dr. Saing Te, media analyst, investigator, realist.
Climate change is also a gender issue, a culture issue, regional issue, a local issue. It's spread across differently and the impacts are going to be different for different people.
The richest half of the world are responsible for 86% of greenhouse gas emissions, and the poorest half for just 14%.
Extreme weather patterns and rising sea levels are already forcing people to relocate.
Industrialized nations need to spend far more to help developing countries cope with the impacts of climate change.
The idea of the phrase protecting the environment being problematic because it kind of states or assumes that there's this like external threat rather than taking the ownership that like the threat is us. We have created that.
Climate change. A surprisingly difficult subject to do an episode on, mainly because the shelf life of climate research is so short. 12 months after something has been published, it might become completely void. Because while the macro, the climate crisis as a whole, remains constant, the micro is constantly changing and updating, and it's almost always bad news. And even if we feel informed about the climate, we often feel helpless to make change because it's all problems and only limited answers, which leads to compassion fatigue. We feel informed, we care a lot, and we still do very little. And that's what this episode is about. How do we keep people interested in bad news? Let's ask the big questions with Dr. Saing Te. This is PhD Unpacked.
Before we get into your research, can you, I guess, start by telling us a little bit about your background and like how you ended up writing this PhD specifically?
Okay, so I did a bachelor's in history and Spanish, and then took a little break. Then then did my honours actually in history, and then I took a little break, and then realised that I kind of wanted something more practical in terms of like kind of background skills, and so I did a master's in so in communication studies. Then took another break. Then I think in 2016 came back from a stint working overseas, picked up a new job, and I wasn't 100% sure where that was going, and then so I wrote a research proposal, applied for a scholarship, and then got that, and then did my PhD. In terms of the topic itself, I think I've just always been really interested in terms of the disjunction between knowledge and action. You would think that having one would lead to the other, and so for me, I think back in 2016 when I think about it, given the situation in terms of like what is happening in terms of global warming and climate change, that we weren't really doing what we should be doing, and so I kind of really wanted to get a better understanding as to why that possibly was the case. I think my research proposal at the time was something like compassion fatigue, the emotional burden of climate change. As the research progressed and obviously the title changed, you just couldn't pin it down to compassion fatigue in terms of inaction. And then so that's how the thesis kind of took its own shape and form from there onwards.
And am I right in thinking that, did your master's have something to do with like public relations and greenwashing and stuff? So earlier in that postgrad process, you had sort of already got into this world of like, how do we think about public relations of what is happening and how that information kind of passes down to other people, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think my master's looked at specifically like coal mining and then corporate public relations and then greenwashing, and then so this one here looks more focused more on news representation of it too. So obviously we use quite a lot of the same kind of ideas, and then it also interviewed journalists too. So I was trying to get more an idea about the representation of it.
I think it's worth pointing out that even though this topic, I guess, is like so omnipresent in society and culture, there can be terms that are used that people think mean the same thing and don't mean the same thing, or vice versa. And one thing that you mention in your PhD is that sometimes people use global warming and climate change like interchangeably, but actually those aren't necessarily the same thing. Like one thing, global warming, causes the other, climate change, but then there's lots of different ways to frame like climate crisis, climate emergency, climate collapse, climate breakdown. The specificity of the words, like in the title you chose climate crisis. Did it take you a long time to choose that version of, I guess there's so many different ways that we talk about what is going on?
like there's a whole history behind whether global warming or climate change was used, in terms of public discourse. Initially, I think global warming was considered by some to be too of an alarmist, like the globe is warming. And then when you get stuff down to like climate change, well, the climate changes. And then so it kind of seems like it's more of a, I would say, easier thing to digest for people. I think there was like an American strategist or something at that time too, didn't want, much action to take place. And then so he put out a memo basically saying that, we should use climate change more. Because it's easy, it's less likely to get people concerned about it. So that's also a thing too. That's why language and word choices are very important in terms of what they encompass. And I think climate crisis for me was a shift away from global warming and climate change. And then basically I think it was more of a representation of actual state of crisis that we are actually in.
Yeah.
And then so I think for me that was what it was in terms of choosing those two words together.
It's interesting that you mentioned that person and their agenda behind why choosing one word over the other, and I guess that kind of takes us nicely into where I want to start, I guess, with the state of play with your PhD. Is there's this really interesting phrase in your research about the linkages of power to communication process, and it might seem strange, but actually I guess I'm less interested in talking about the science of climate change, and I'm more interested in talking about the way that the climate crisis isn't just about science, and it's but as much about capitalism and greed and consumption and consumerism and I guess big business and power. That seems like a big part of your research, at least in some of the chapters, stating that it's not just about the science, it's about who is communicating the discourse about what's going on, right?
Yeah, I mean, like if anything, like if you want to identify a problem, right, you've got to find out what the cause of the problem is, right? And then so just basically saying what CO2 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, and then that's it. Like in terms of you've got to start, backpedaling a bit and trying to figure out how it got there, why is it there? And then for me, I think, when I keep taking it back further and everything, it's lifestyle. And the lifestyles that we've actually got quite comfortable with. In terms of thinking about that, then we talk about what drives that kind of lifestyle, and then so I think if you look at some of the scholars talk about whether or not the difference between, when you talk about a product and everything, it's like the use value of it, what we use it for, the exchange value, which is the price of it, and then we have something else which we call the symbolic value. And so what it symbolizes to have that product or to have that experience, and then so how all those are connected. And then for me, I think the problem with just looking at it from a science angle is the fact that you don't see the drivers and who stands to gain from this. So when you buy something, when you use something, aside from you, like if it's a practical kind of a thing, but then who else makes a profit from it? And then so when you start taking that back, and then some people are making a lot of money out of a lot of the things which are not necessarily, I would say, needed. So then we start having discussions about needs and wants, and whether or not we are consuming more and more of the things that we want but we don't necessarily need, and is that at the expense of the environment? And so I think this is where the whole consumerism kind of comes down to it. And then, you've got to be fair. I don't want to homogenize consumption or people in general and everything. But we've gone to a stage where I think we've consumed a lot more than the capacity that the world basically, obviously, can handle. And then so obviously consumption has consequences. You've got to take something out in order to create something, and then at the end of it when you're using it as well, and then also when you dispose of it, and then when you use it, when you get something else again from it. And so it's a continuous cycle. So I think more needs to be you kind of really need to think of it as a whole entire complete from its inception to its end. And I think we a lot of the time we don't see that. You don't see how, I don't know, like these items come to about. It's just here, but when you break it down in terms of where they came from, how they came to be built and then put together.
There's something really interesting in one of the chapters about the idea of the phrase protecting the environment being problematic, because it kind of states or assumes that there's this external threat, rather than taking the ownership that the threat is us. We have created that, and I think there's an interrelation between that and what you've spoken about the science, because so much of humanity are not scientists. When you break it down into numbers and CO2 and greenhouse gases or carbon emissions, it feels very other, because the way we can process all those numbers is less than if you were to break it down into the idea of like power and greed and the way that we use the planet. Feels like something that we could and we should take more ownership of. And I thought that was really interesting, the framing of it as like an external threat rather than something that...
Well, it's confronting. I think everybody's kind of like aware that basically, we have been called to like think about how we live, and that involves, what we're buying, what we're using, how we're traveling, how we're keeping warm, what we're eating. So that in itself is quite confronting in terms of basically having to question or rethink basically how you live your life.
There's also something interesting about, it's another concept you bring up, this term, the obfuscation of nature, about, I guess, how these words like humanity and nature can kind of be portrayed in this like abstract way, which limits people's ability to kind of understand the origin of the crisis, or it limits people's way to figure out like the problem is tangible and the solution is tangible. That was really interesting to me, the idea that humanity or nature or the globe has sometimes been portrayed in a way that's really like not wishy-washy, but in an intangible way, and so people aren't able to relate to it in a way that actually in some ways it is really tangible, right? The data shows, you can point towards how, as you said, in the historical process, how did we get here and what can we do about it now? I hadn't thought about the idea that making something abstract makes it harder to, I guess, relate to, deal with, react to.
If you can think about it in terms of what you do, like, it's a conscious choice as opposed to something that is just kind of like you just fall into, right? And then so I think, but because of that distinction and everything, then you've got to take responsibility for it. So that's what it is in terms of like confronting, in terms of seeing the order. I think when I talk about human and nature, we talk about a lot of the time, like humanity is like up here and nature is somewhere down here. It's subservient to human desires and needs and everything, and it can be, it can be molded into whatever we kind of want it to be. But then climate change is really challenging that point of view, right? Because it's just saying, wait a minute, like I've got my own ideas, and we're in the midst of a crisis. You've got extreme weather events, you've got melting water caps, you've got rising sea levels, and the list goes on. And so it's the idea that basically challenging how we center ourselves, which is obviously we all understand that it's your world, you are important, and so that's how you see it. But in reality, you've got to start thinking about what you inhabit. And so basically you inhabit, it's technically basically we inhabit the earth, not necessarily the earth inhabits us, kind of a way of thinking about it.
In your research, part of what you did was analyse media articles from Stuff in New Zealand, Herald, to look at how media had spoken about the climate crisis. What did you find in that research generally about the way that our media had tried to describe, I guess, the climate crisis from a New Zealand perspective? Because I guess just fundamentally those media companies are within New Zealand, even though the topic might be a global experience. In general, what did you find in that research of those articles?
I think I found, I think I called it 4 structural absences. And so the first one was, I think, a long chronological view. So in terms of timeline, I think it was almost always kind of more in the present as opposed to drawing it back into the past. And so, if you have a longer view, you can understand how things come about more, and then how it just doesn't seem like an accident. Like it didn't just happen overnight, but it seems like that sometimes when if it gets taken out of that kind of context. So, and that's another thing with the whole capitalism anyway, and as well, and in terms of like consumption and everything, when you look at how fast it grew in terms of just what we were consuming, and then obviously the pollution and the emissions that we put out, and so in a longer chronological kind of view of the crisis, there's more accountability. I think tying into that too is just historical consciousness. Those that are kind of like least responsible for it, we're talking about those obviously living along the equator, and we've got like poorer communities, marginalised communities. Those that are least responsible for it basically are suffering the most. And so that's why historical consciousness is very important. And then the second one, I would have talked, about fossil capitalism. So in New Zealand, there's a lot of focus on agriculture, and agriculture does contribute a lot to our our emissions, but you don't really see the same emphasis placed on fossil fuels or use of fossil fuels. And obviously, in terms of our sparse population, the amount of cars we have on the road, and actually quite a lot of old cars as well, and then also how unaffordable basically for a lot of people electric vehicles are, and then whether or not our grid can support it as well. Fossil capitalism plays a big role in terms of slowing down the recognition of the problem that we have. I mean, you've got a whole like a whole denial, doubt and delay kind of like campaign that has been launched. I think Exxon's been used a lot in terms of an example, and so they their efforts obviously confuse some people, and they actually do sometimes slow it down as well in terms of the progress. And then I think the third one was about forefronting solutions, basically. So I think the focus has been a lot about the science and a lot about the bad outcomes that are to come and everything. But the thing is, if it's constantly framed in that way, it's quite hard to engage. And then because you're just reading bad news all the time, and then after a while it becomes much of a muchness. And then so it's important to also weave in proactive stuff too. And then there are a lot of things being done as well at the same time that people are there are some that are very engaged in the issues, and they are developing ways in which to make the earth a place that's more sustainable.
And so obviously as well as looking at the specific media representations, you did what I thought was the potentially more interesting thing of going and speaking to environmental and science journalists themselves to discover what their perspectives were on creating these pieces of media, which I thought was really fascinating, because in the past on PhD Unpacked we've done episodes that have interacted with journalism, but we haven't spent so much time focusing on what it is like to be a journalist and their perspectives on how they can convey stories in a certain area. What was that experience like? Were you always going to speak to the journalists? Like when you figured that you're going to look at New Zealand media representations, had you always planned to go and speak to people, or did that come later in your kind of process and you thought, actually, this is just as important?
I actually really want to talk to all the sources in the news articles, but it got quite hard to try and get people to show up or get people to talk to me. And so the journalists were kind of easier in terms of getting to talk to me. But then also I did find that basically by the time I think I started interviewing them around 2019. And then I think we were in the midst of COVID, and then so it was quite hard to wrangle them, to some of them to come. We did end up doing phone interviews to talk to me, but then also a lot of people had moved on, so it kind of really, in some respects, talked to the nature of the work itself. And I think I really wanted a whole kind of more of a holistic kind of view of it. So you see what's been written, but what goes into informing it, and whether or not it's a true reflection of what somebody actually thinks of the issues or what they've been asked to talk about. So that was what I wanted. And then in terms of journalists, I thought it would just be more complete, just to see what their struggles are, what their challenges are in terms of making a news item. And sometimes too, I think when you just read a piece, you just see it as a piece and everything. You don't really think about what really goes into it. And whether or not, I suppose, in terms of the limitations that I found in the news media, whether or not they've had thought of it as well, but it's just something that basically the culture of the newsroom doesn't really want. And then so just getting a better understanding of stuff, I think that was the real reason about it, in terms of just doing those interviews. Because
it would have been quite, I don't want to say it would have been easy to do anything. This is all framed within years of research within your PhD, but I guess it would have been easier to analyse the media representations, simply say they need to do better and draw a line under that. It's a more nuanced conversation to say the media articles are limited, but actually here are potentially some reasons why, and it's not as simple as saying journalists need to do a better job. That can absolutely be true, but it seemed like in your findings from speaking to those journalists, they fundamentally found it really challenging to convey that kind of news to audiences. And that kind of brings us to the crux of what we find so fascinating about your PhD, about it being so hard to convey the climate crisis to people. Was that pretty clear amongst everyone that you spoke to about how difficult that job is?
Yeah, I mean, the nature of the issue, it's kind of really hard to engage. I mean, it's moved on quite a lot from what it was back in the day, and journalism itself has moved back in the day. I mean, back in the day, everybody would, there was this thing about balance, like you would need to say every side of the story in order to make it seem like it was that people weren't taking sides, or that the journalists or that news institution wasn't taking side. And I think that for a long time did kind of stalled the advancement of climate change, because for a long time people were still debating if it was actually happening. And then so for balance, somebody would always put somebody that agreed with climate change and then somebody that disagreed with climate change. But then over time, when you realize that there are about 95 people that agree and about 4 or 5 people that don't agree, so you can't, that whole idea about balance started being a bit challenged. And then so we kind of shift away from that. And then also, most of the journalists are science or environmental journalists, and then so for me, I think they predominantly stuck to those kind of areas, and so that to me was quite a limitation. But you can almost understand why they stuck to those areas, because those are their areas. And then also, I think trying to convey to people, which I think the issue itself, just talking about pollution, way of living, and was just hard to find different ways to talk about the same thing. There are certain peaks of when news would be reported on, so generally during the climate summits, or if you're getting extreme weather events, so all those kind of things are basically when you start talking about or start writing about climate change. And then the reportage is basically almost the same. You always get some, it would still be a bad outcome. Technically, we're still screwed. 6 months later, a year later, we're still screwed. And then so it's what else can they write? Or how else can they frame that? And so I think they also found those kind of things to be quite hard as well. And then there's stuff like the emissions trading scheme, which is a very mixed bag of things, which do not make sense to quite a lot of people. Capturing people's attention is it's hard. Yeah,
figuring out that specific access point to... Everyone is different and has a different level of understanding, and people obviously live, as you said, different lifestyles. So creating news pieces that can hit to every specific individual that is engaging in that news must be really difficult. And one thing that you spoke about was this term info glut, which I thought was really interesting. I guess just the idea that the saturation of climate crisis media has potentially reached a point where there's just too much information, and as you say, if it's all just 6 months later we're screwed, 6 months later we're screwed, 6 months later we're screwed, we as humans aren't great at continuing to be bombarded with it, and actually maybe somewhere along the line we just reached a saturation point, and for the vast majority of people you just start to switch off because you accept that we're in a situation, but because you're reading about it, hearing about it so constantly, we don't want to engage with it anymore, or maybe we can't engage with it anymore because there's just so much of it. That was something that I definitely felt true to just the specifics of my own personal experience.
Yeah, it's definitely hard to stay engaged if they're constantly reporting it basically the same.
Yeah.
So that's where the whole entire thing about, you need different way, you need to frame it in different ways. You need to bring up different issues. You need to look at what's been done elsewhere, the solutions, the happy news. It's like with anything. You look at the coverage of the Ukraine war. That's just a recent example, right? There was a point where it was everywhere, and now it's still happening, but do you get the same attention of it? It's basically, I think it speaks to the fact that news, it's also a corporate good, right? And whether or not people are actually tuning into those issues, and so that's also a reason why they start to disappear from the headlines, and whether or not there's anything new to it too. If it's the same as it ever was kind of reporting, people are really not going to, there's so much information out there and there's so much things that you can consume now. Why would you read the same thing over again or the same depressing fact again? So if there's nothing new to it, there's no novelty to it, it's not really impacting people in terms of the here and now. So yeah, the issue with climate change, because I think a lot of it, the science has been established, and that, climate change in terms of what is changing in terms of, the weather, is already kind of established. It's just basically the magnitude and the rate of change, which everybody's talking about, and then obviously the scale of the impacts and the harm.
Or it might be, and this is something that's in your research, not so much that they don't care, and of course there are people that fit into that box, but what I found really interesting was the idea you raise about, I guess, apathy coming from the fact that people feel informed, and because they feel informed more so than they were in the past, or perhaps more informed compared to people around them, something happens in us that because we feel more informed on a subject, it feels like we have made a difference. Like the idea of your social conscience has to some level been cleaned, but being more informed about something doesn't necessarily translate to someone taking more action. And that was sort of a light bulb moment to me. I was like, the Ukraine war being a good example. You go from a point of not knowing to knowing slightly more, and it feels like you have engaged with an issue to some degree, and then the next step doesn't always happen. That was really fascinating to me, that idea of like apathy, or like inadvertent apathy coming, and that idea of like passive knowledge, which I think overlaps with that idea of compassion fatigue to some extent, right? Like the you become desensitized to something and you feel more informed about it, and then like you kind of disengage because you feel like you have become more educated, but then sometimes it just like trails off.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, yeah, climate change is a definite, like, an emotional journey. Okay, so there'll be moments where basically you will be a whole lot more proactive, and there'll be moments when you're completely quite pessimistic about everything, and then so you can mistake certain things, like you said, like knowledge for actually like you're actually doing something. You could buy a new light bulb which saves more power, but then you can leave the light on the whole entire day and night, and whether that's kind of counterintuitive. It's a lot of competing interests sometimes too, where you just feel like if you read it, you understand it, I know it, But there's also, there's a lot of things you can fall into too, basically, there are other people doing it, other people looking after it. There are people that are paid to solve this kind of issues. Political leaders are here, so basically, they're going to be, they're tasked to if it's a big problem, they'll deal with it. You've got heaps of kind of like ways out for people to console themselves with their inaction.
It feels like, I don't know what the period of time is, 5, 10, 15 years. As you see it, there was a period of time within news where it was providing both sides of the story. Like, is climate change here? Is it real? By no means am I stating that everyone in the world, everyone in New Zealand believes in climate change. We know that's not true. Even if it is only 5%, we know that's not true. It feels like we're more landed in this place where a majority of people, or at least far more than 5, 10, 15 years ago, believe climate change to be existing, can point to certain issues that, in everyday life contribute to that, whether it is consumption of meat, emissions from cars. The Joe Public layman New Zealander is way more informed than we used to be, but everyone might be making incremental change, but it doesn't necessarily mean that what has happened in the last however many years has in action matched the amount of knowledge changing that has gone on for people.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you look at global emissions, they have been rising. I mean, if you look at our emissions itself, I think from like 1990 to 2021, basically, they're growing on average 0.6%, a year. And then so basically, we are not doing enough. So even though we feel like we have, and then, I mean, in some cases, some people might be doing a lot, okay? And then so, the question is whether or not, as a society, as a country, are we doing enough, like now, in terms of, and then if we're not, how can that be made more easy? And then so this is where your structural change and the institutional infrastructure change and everything that needs to take place. Leaving it up to the individual, while it's important, is possibly not going to get us there to where we need to get. Yeah,
and that's one of the, in your research, you point to a whole lot of reasons, both from other academics who've pointed out the different reasons, traits, why it's difficult to engage with the climate crisis, and you also, in your own analysis, sort of provide your own list. One of those reasons that you provide is that people can understand and care a lot and still do very little, and that can be for a whole lot of reasons. What they do can be like tokenistic, or people can see the issue, believe something needs to happen, but feel completely helpless. There's the classic, well, I know the stat isn't going to be right, but like 80% of the world's emissions come from X number of corporations. That I've had those conversations with people, and it can be pretty hard to fault that line of thinking. Like, when we know that for the most part these massive corporations are doing the most damage, it's all very well for an individual to understand what's going on and know what they can do in their own lifestyle to make change. But that, I think the words you describe as environmental melancholia, that idea that like it seems so terrible that even if you're pretty informed, it's kind of understandable that you might feel like you can't actually make that much of a difference.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's true. I mean, the future is pretty bleak, and then like I would say, obviously, like, I'm a pretty pessimistic person, right? But still, like, I'm here 6-7 o'clock at night on a Sunday, still trying to talk to you. Yeah, still talking to you about it. And then so that's the thing too. I think it's important, regardless, like, climate change is kind of shrouded in a lot of negativity, and rightfully so. But it doesn't have to be just that. Yeah. I mean, the future's still up in the air. Yeah, sure, it looks pretty bad and everything, but I still think that there's an opportunity for change. Yeah. And there's a lot of opportunities for a lot of different kind of change. And so I think it's important to kind of see it as also a chance for a different kind of future. Yeah. Okay, so there's a lot of things that can still be shaped. We're talking about changing basically, our electricity, our transport, in terms of even our interactions of day-to-day life, in terms of even basically how our food systems are. So there's a lot of change that can happen, and then you can actually steer into a bigger, better, brighter kind of future than what's basically looking ahead to us right now. Yeah. So basically, I think it's important. I think it's important to still invest in the future.
Yeah, and part of that is this conversation that we're having, and what your research investigates is we need to figure out why people can care and want to make change, but don't or can't. Like what is it that is in our humanity that makes us feel so unable to make change, and how can we slightly reframe what is going on with the climate crisis and how that relates to like any given individual, depending on where they are in life, what they do for a job, where they live, like how.
I don't know. Because I don't know, when you say that, makes me think of this line, from Stanley Cohen. We're talking about like just having the news attention on it is not the same as having like the audience are basically reading it. Yeah. Then it's not the same thing as the audience understanding it. Yeah. So basically, it's important to know that there are limits in terms of like just individual limits, in terms of even just communication limits and everything. And so this is where it's very important to think in a bigger kind of picture kind of frame, and that's why if your options are only something that are sustainable, that's environmentally friendly, then that takes the thinking out of it. And so this is where it's important in terms of basically who governs the country, who rules, like in terms of the climate policies that we have. And so if it takes up, because like people are short on time, people are short on money too, okay? And then so sometimes like even in like trying to be environmentally friendly can cost quite a lot. And then there's a time where I have to sit there and compare, in terms of what I'm buying and where it's from and what's in it and everything. And then that just takes time, And then so really these choices should be easy. Yeah,
it's only when changes are made that days, months, years later, you realise that a change has been made. Like I was at the veggie markets the other day and I said to my partner, I was like, remember when we just bought our shopping with like plastic bags? And I think definitely in Wellington, I'm not sure if it's in New Zealand, like single use like plastic food packaging has just been like, it is now like it's just happened. And in those moments, there are always the people that will say like, we'll compare that to all the like deep sea oil drilling, it's just like a drop in the ocean. But it's not until you kind of realize how much things have changed down the line, you go, actually that is something that we used to do, and we just decided to change it. And like that one day where I realized that we hadn't had plastic bags for however long, like that actually did fill me with a little bit of hope, because it made me remember that we were in place A and we just don't do that anymore. And I think it is possible to find like little moments of positivity, because as you say, if it's all just negative from the media, from how we feel about ourselves and our own like individual lifestyles, that doesn't necessarily turn into more action being made. I guess it's just trying to find new ways to like come up with small matters that feel like they make a difference. Yeah, I guess it's just this constant balancing of how we think about the big picture and how we think about our own small role. That is this constant cycle that I imagine most people in the 95% that are trying to process this huge crisis like we just deal with on a daily. A point in the in your research, I think it's in your second chapter, you do actually talk about like effective climate change communication and how can we approach this in a way that is striking that balance between like underplaying the problem and like overselling the problem and finding that grey area. And I thought I'd read out the 7 kind of key principles that are stated and maybe get your thoughts on that list as a whole. The first is to know your audience. The second, to get your audience's attention. The third, beware of the overuse of emotional appeals. Fourth, address scientific and climate uncertainties. 5, tap into social identities and affiliations. 6, encourage group participation. And 7, make behaviour change easier. Are there any of those that kind of stand out to you in particular? I guess it's been a couple of years since you've published your research, as how you think about like how we can make more, positive climate crisis communication, because it has been a few years and obviously you spent a significant period of time thinking about that. Where you are now in relation to your research, how do you think about this world of like how can we communicate about what's going on in a way that is not necessarily better, I don't love that word, but is maybe more positive, effective, has the ability to make more change? I don't know how to phrase it.
Yeah, I think it really just depends. Like, it's really important to know your audience. That's what I think it's kind of heightened to me more, is to basically know your audience and where they're at. It's very. And then it's also important to clarify any kind of like misunderstandings. Persisting in some discussions where I feel like, if you get somebody who does not believe in climate change, it's just better to ask them questions, in terms of get an understanding of how they see things and why.
And I guess to tie this conversation back to the element of your research that was about looking at how the New Zealand media writes about the climate crisis. Do you think that, generally media, outside of the PhD, just the way that you exist in your everyday life and you experience climate crisis media in the same way that we do in New Zealand, do you feel like more of the focus has become on solutions, small things that we can do? Like, do you think there's been a change since the 2017 when the articles were written, a few years later when you were doing the research, to kind of hear where we are now? Do you think that has changed at all?
I do think so. I think there's a whole lot. I think when I was looking at it, there weren't even sections on the environment, and there is now. There are teams as well. And I think when I was actually looking at it, I think they was just started. Like, stuff had just started. Like a two. I don't know if you call that a team, but it was a 2-person kind of crew. And now you get headings. You get like, if you go on like on the website, the news website, they've actually got the headings for like the environment and climate change, and then so I think yes, and then also I think also that the nature of news has changed a bit as well. So you'll find that there's a lot more opinion pieces. So in that regards, there's more license to say stuff in terms of in terms of prescribing kind of like remedies for having an opinion. Where you think journalists are not. It's not really about them asserting their opinion. I mean, they can assemble stuff and then kind of like put it out in a certain way and everything, but they're not. It's meant to be, news is factual. What news is now has changed because also basically I think like the way in which the progression of the digital platforms as well, like basically the media environment has changed, and I think the news organisations and news institutions are catching up with that, and then audience interest as well in terms of what kind of news they're reading. And so I do think it is definitely changing from what it was. Yeah,
because it feels like there was a point in time where it was all just here is the science that you don't want to know because it paints the awful picture. And sure, stuff still comes out that portrays what's going on in not in a new way, but I guess new content. Like I think of the latest, I think it's David Attenborough's Our Planet 2. All it takes is for Netflix to drop 5 new episodes with his wonderful voice and the pictures of the animals where their climate is clearly changing for like a visual reminder of like new content that plants that in people's conscious in a way that is framed in a way that's easier to consume than like a stuff article. All of a sudden it's on Netflix and it's shot and produced and narrated beautifully. There is like a constant refresh of that, but to complement that, it feels like I'm reading more of the like this change makes this much difference, doing this makes this much, rather than 5 years ago where it did feel like here are the glacier stats, here are like the rising sea level stats.
Yeah, no, I also think it's just that people are a whole lot more aware now as well in terms of basically what works in terms of communicating to people.
Yeah.
And then that's why I think they are adapting to the change. I mean, so I think people are more in tune with what people want.
Yeah.
And what speaks to people more. And then so I think so I think like the docos, even like, for example, if you look at like the way in which they represent statistics now, the infographics and everything, that's completely changed from what it used to be too.
Yeah.
And then so I think people so I think the news itself is also getting a whole lot more visual, more interactive, and it should be to engage people more.
Yeah. So much of this is trying to balance the here and now versus the there and then versus what was in the past in terms of how we got here. Maybe one of the few hopeful things we can do to remind ourselves that we are capable of making change is to actually realize the fact that if we were in a room where, say, there are 100 New Zealanders and now like 96 of those people believe that climate change is happening and are probably doing at least one thing different from a lifestyle than they did 5 years ago, that is actually progress compared to then what it was 10 years ago, and we spend so much time focusing on the fact that we must continue to make change, which we do have to, and we don't want to actually recognize that, or maybe we should just recognize that humans are capable of changing in their actions.
I mean, I think it's definitely like a pendulum. You've got your you've got the hope and the fear, right? But it's one of the things where you can't be weighed down by the fear, but then you can't be kind of like oblivious in the optimism that's coming ahead. So it's striking a balance. I think you can visit each realm now and then, but it's important just to come back into the centre and then just focus on what you can do, and then focus on what you can do. Talk about the issues, participate in your community. There's elections, there's local elections, there's national elections, show up to things, ask questions, and so definitely engage, be engaged with the issue. If you don't know something, look it up, or ask somebody about it, and then do what you can. My thesis is that the pressure needs to be put on those in power, and I'm not just talking political power, we're talking about corporate power as well. Well,
we appreciate you taking the time to come in to talk to us today, to talk to me about your research. I know it's been a couple of years since it was published, and I imagine it must be, I don't want to say it brings back up some things that you had to think about for a few years, but I just want to say thank you so much for coming in to talk about it, because I know it's a huge piece of work that covers a whole lot of different things. From us, thank you so much for coming in and giving your time to talk about it. The PhD is Confronting the Climate Crisis in New Zealand, News Representation and Problems of Political Action. Dr. Saing Te, thank you so much for coming on PhD Unpacked.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for watching this episode from Season 3 of PhD Unpacked. For previous episodes from this season and Seasons 1 and 2, check us out on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, as well as other listening platforms, and follow us, PhD Unpacked, on Instagram and TikTok.